The old iron gates of St. Mercy's Asylum groaned as Jason pushed them open, their rusty hinges protesting against the intrusion. It was a grudging welcome, as if the asylum itself was reluctant to let him in.
The young security guard took a deep breath, the metallic scent of rust mixing with the damp night air, filling his lungs with a sense of foreboding. He could almost taste the fear that clung to this place, a fear that seemed to seep from the very walls.
The asylum loomed before him, a gothic silhouette against the silver-sheeted sky, its dark presence dominating the landscape. Its vacant windows, like empty eyes, stared back at him, offering no comfort, only a silent, eerie challenge. Jason shivered, pulling his thin jacket tighter around himself, trying to ward off the chill that seemed to emanate from the very ground.
The job advertisement had mentioned night watchman, previous experience preferred but not required, and a surprisingly generous hourly rate, which had caught his eye immediately. Desperate for money, Jason hadn't asked too many questions, his need for a job outweighing his caution. Now, staring at the decaying grandeur of St. Mercy's, he wished he had taken the time to learn more.
He parked his beat-up Ford by the main entrance, its headlights doing little to pierce the oppressive darkness that seemed to emanate from the asylum, as if the building itself was absorbing the light. Each footstep towards the main doors echoed in the silence, the sound swallowed by the night, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. As he reached for the heavy handle, a gust of wind rattled the wrought iron gates behind him, as if warning him back, urging him to reconsider. Ignoring the unease twisting in his gut, Jason stepped inside, determined to face whatever lay ahead. The asylum welcomed him with a cold, musty embrace, the air thick with the scent of decay and neglect. The air was thick with the silence of ages and the spectral residue of forgotten suffering, a palpable weight pressing down on him. It was a silence that seemed to scream, a haunting echo of the past that refused to be silenced. The only light in the cavernous reception area came from a flickering fluorescent bulb above a dusty counter. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and neglect, making the atmosphere even more oppressive. Behind it sat a woman, her face half-shadowed, her expression unreadable. Her eyes seemed to pierce through the dim light, scrutinizing every move. She looked as if she'd been carved from the very stone of St. Mercy's, as old and unyielding as the asylum itself. Her presence was as imposing as the building's crumbling walls.
You Jason?
Yes, ma'am, Jason stammered, intimidated by her intense gaze. He could feel his palms sweating as he tried to maintain eye contact.
For the night shift.
The woman grunted, pushing a heavy register towards him. The sound of the register scraping across the counter echoed in the empty room.
Sign here.
As Jason scribbled his name, she spoke again. Her voice was a low murmur, almost as if she was sharing a secret.
Place hasn't been used in 50 years, but the owner's got plans. Fancy flats, he's thinking. Thinks a bit of money'll scrub the stains off this place. She chuckled humorlessly. Some stains go deeper than paint. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning.
Jason looked up from the register, a question forming on his lips. He hesitated, unsure if he should ask. But the woman, Margaret, she'd said her name was, continued, her voice low and urgent. There was a sense of urgency in her tone that made Jason's heart race.
You keep to your rounds. Don't go poking about, and if you hear anything at all... She paused, fixing him with a look that sent shivers down his spine. Her eyes bore into his, as if trying to convey the gravity of her warning. Don't go looking for it. The finality in her voice left no room for doubt.
Armed with a flashlight and a walkie-talkie that crackled with static even when switched off, Jason began his rounds. The dim light barely pierced the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The old asylum was a labyrinth of corridors and wards, each more unsettling than the last. The walls seemed to close in on him, the silence amplifying every creak and groan of the ancient building. The air grew colder as he ventured deeper, carrying the scent of decay and disinfectant. It was as if the building itself was exhaling its last dying breath.
He walked past padded cells, their doors hanging open like the mouths of hungry beasts, Each cell seemed to whisper tales of torment and despair. Restraints lay scattered on the floor, cold metal reminders of the anguish that had once echoed within these walls. The sight sent a shiver down his spine.
The silence was heavy, oppressive, broken only by the sound of his own footsteps and the occasional drip of water from a leaking pipe. It felt as though the building was holding its breath, waiting. In the distance, a floorboard creaked. Jason stopped, holding his breath, his hand tightening around his flashlight. His heart pounded in his chest, echoing in the silence. The sound was gone as quickly as it had come. He told himself it was just the building settling, a natural consequence of age and neglect. But the unease lingered. But a primal fear, cold and sharp, began to gnaw at his composure. It was a fear that whispered of unseen eyes watching from the shadows. Hours crawled by. Each room Jason checked seemed to amplify the building's oppressive silence. Shadows stretched and danced in his flashlight's beam, taking on monstrous, fleeting forms. The wind howled outside, a mournful symphony that snaked its way through the asylum's broken windows, sounding like whispered pleas.
He found himself stopping more frequently, listening intently for any sound besides his own breathing.
The walkie-talkie, silent until now, crackled to life. A burst of static, then a faint, childlike whisper cut through the white noise. Jason froze, straining to make out the words. They were gone as quickly as they'd come. He raised the walkie-talkie to his lips, his hand trembling.
"Hello, Margaret, is that you?"
Only static answered him. He told himself it was just interference, a trick of the old equipment and his own skittish imagination. But he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being followed by something unseen. Section 5. The Ghostly Children of St. Mercy's. At the end of a hallway, a faint light flickered.
It pulsed like a heartbeat, drawing me towards it.
As he approached, the air grew noticeably colder.
The light emanated from a room at the end of the hall.
The door stood slightly ajar, the flickering light spilling out onto the corridor floor.
He could hear music now, a child's music box melody tinkling eerily in the silence.
He pushed the door open, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness.
The room was a former playroom, the walls adorned with faded murals of clowns and balloons.
And in the center of the room, bathed in an ethereal glow, stood a group of children. They were not the living kind. Their eyes were hollow sockets and their skin was the color of parchment. They turned to Jason, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and longing. He stood frozen, his blood turning to ice in his veins. A little girl stepped forward. She wore a tattered white dress, her dark hair framing a pale, heart-shaped face.
Hello?
She whispered, her voice as fragile as spun glass.
We've been waiting for you.
Waiting for me?
We're lonely. We want to play. Will you play with us?
Jason took a hesitant step back. He couldn't tear his gaze from the spectral children, their ethereal forms shimmering like heat haze.
I should be going.
Please don't go. We just want a friend.
What's your name?
Eliza. My name is Eliza.
Jason tried to back away, to turn and run from the spectral apparition and her ghostly companions. He found he couldn't move. Something held him rooted to the spot, an invisible force as strong as steel. Eliza glided towards him, her eyes never leaving his. Her tiny hand, cold as ice, reached out and touched his arm. A jolt of fear, pure and primal, shot through him. He tried to pull away, but Eliza's grip tightened.
Stay with us, Jason. Stay with us forever.
The other children closed in, their spectral forms flickering and swirling around him like phantoms. Their laughter, high-pitched and chilling, filled the room, echoing into the silent corridors beyond. They were all around him now, their icy fingers reaching out, their hollow eyes boring into his soul. Jason thrashed against their intangible grasp, his heart pounding in his chest. But it was no use. They were pulling him in, dragging him down into the darkness that clung to St. Mercy's. Their laughter grew louder, a cacophony that drowned out his own terrified screams. He caught a final glimpse of the outside world, the sliver of moonlit sky visible through the window, before it vanished. The door slammed shut, plunging him into darkness. The children's laughter echoed around him, a chilling reminder of his fate. He was trapped with the ghostly children of St. Mercy's, trapped forever in the asylum's endless night. The morning sun, pale and watery, cast long shadows across the grounds of St. Mercy's Asylum. Birdsong, a jarring contrast to the previous night's eerie silence, filled the air. Margaret, her face drawn and weary, stood at the entrance to the former playroom. She kicked aside a flashlight, its beam long extinguished. It was Jason's. She sighed, her breath a plume of white in the chilly morning air. She'd seen it all before. The lure of the children, the innocent plea for companionship that hid a terrible, desperate need. She'd tried to warn him. Margaret picked up the flashlight, her fingers closing around its cold metal casing.
Some stains go deeper than paint.
She turned and walked away, leaving Jason's flashlight lying on the floor, a silent testament to the asylum's insatiable hunger.